Hello and welcome to the final extra lecture for Justice and Society at Lehman College in fall of 2017. We've been reading Harvard professor Michael Sandel's Justice, and this is going to be on the very last chapter, chapter 10, Justice and the Common Good. So we didn't have time to read chapters 7, 8, or 9. Unfortunately, in an ideal world, we get to all of the parts of Sandel's argument before we looked at his conclusion, but I'm going to give you a quick summary of what we've covered so far and the chapters that we've missed. Chapter 7 is a case study about affirmative action. Chapter 8 is an introduction to Aristotle's virtue ethics. And Chapter 9 is a discussion about individualism versus civic or community connectedness. Okay, so before we get to a little bit more information about those three chapters, let's think about summarizing what we have read. Recall that Sandel has discussed with us three competing principles which underlie justice in society: freedom, welfare, and virtue. And after he talked about what those things were for us, we looked at how libertarianism, utilitarianism, Kant or Kantian ethics, and Rawls address or don't address these principles. Remember that libertarians advocate for self-ownership and as much personal liberty as possible. Welfare, so the general human welfare, and virtue are up to the individual without government interference. It's a personal matter. So they think that the government shouldn't have anything to do with it whatsoever. They acknowledge that everyone has a moral system or code, and that the general welfare of all of humanity or all of the citizens in a society matters. But they think private citizens are the ones that need to get together and decide how to organize that. Utilitarians, on the other hand, advocate for maximum welfare. Individual rights and individual freedoms can't be guaranteed in the face of the greater good. And virtues, whatever they are, only matter in regard to increasing happiness or utility. Utilitarians can't say which values matter more than others. They can't argue for the content. They can only say that virtues matter insofar as they make people overall happier. Kant's doctrine focuses on the individual motivation that people have when they're faced with moral situations. So, in conjunction with that, he sets the foundation for an idea of individual human rights. We have to motivate ourselves to act morally with our reasons, using our own given moral law, and that's the categorical imperative. So this is humanity stripped of all sort of individual traits. Just the idea, remember, that we're moral individuals and we're free. So we have to respect every single human that can think and reason morally and is free to do so or not to do so. He thought that that's the only place moral responsibility can come in, because if you're not free, you're just acting based on the natural laws of the universe, on instinct, on physical and chemical laws. So if we can use our reason to be free, we'll get to the categorical imperative, which respects each person's freedom and rationality without exception. Okay, so more of a summary. Rawls's system is sometimes referred to as liberal egalitarianism. The liberal refers to classical liberalism. Remember that we discussed that, and it's a long tradition in political thinking that involves, and most fundamentally, a defense of individual liberty. Every single person is as free as possible. The egalitarianism part of liberal egalitarianism is in reference to making social institutions as fair as possible for everyone, regardless of individual traits and social status. So Rawls is still looking at what makes a human being here, and it's the reasonableness and also the idea of fairness, that a moral system that we impose on the world or try to impose on the world needs to be fair to everyone, regardless of what you were lucky or unlucky to be born into. So a rich family or a poor family, a first world country or a third world country, or even your individual traits. You certainly didn't choose if you were born naturally smart or strong or athletic. So that, Rawls always thought, was also due to luck. And it didn't make you deserve more or less than anybody else morally. Economically is another story, but morally, every single person has that core that needs to be respected. Now, we didn't get to read about virtue ethics in the Sandel text, but we did read a very short selection on virtue ethics in the main textbook. It was only 2 pages. We didn't spend much time on it. If you need, you can take a look back at it. It's called Virtue Ethics by Bernard Mayo. We'll expand on it a little bit here. It was made into a major, very, very influential system by Aristotle. Remember, Aristotle is Plato's student. So we had Socrates taught Plato, and Plato taught Aristotle. There's a lot about Aristotle's systems of thought that are similar to Plato, but they do differ on some major issues. Aristotle expanded Plato's system of what virtue and justice are or should be. But he did agree that you can't have a just society without just individuals. So that recalls back when we read the Republic, and Socrates and Plato argued that you needed a balance of the soul. You need just individuals working together in concert to make a just society. So if you need just individuals, how do you get them? They're built, according to Aristotle, through just actions. So whenever you're confronted with any situation, you ought to perform in a certain way if you want to get to a certain end. Remember now, if you have your own desires, then those are contingent. They're different for everyone. You have to act in you're still compelled to act in a certain way in order to get your end. So if you want to be fit, you have to eat the right kinds of food and exercise. And you're impelled to do that. You must do that if you want to meet that goal. So if you want to become virtuous, it's the same thing. You have to practice performing virtue. And in a lot of situations, there's a way you think you ought to behave. It doesn't really matter that values shift and change over time. Everybody always has an idea on how we ought to behave or how we ought not to behave. Furthermore, there are virtues common to many societies, and they're very persistent throughout history. So it's not something that's easy to take out of human life. For almost every single thing we do, there's a way that you should behave and a way you shouldn't behave, depending on what the goal is. Here is a chart of common virtues. A lot of these were in Aristotle's treatise about morality called the Nicomachean Ethics. This is his doctrine of the mean, if you've ever heard of that. You see the list of virtues in the center: courage, temperance, tolerance, friendliness, industriousness, nurturing, confident, careful. And different contexts call for different virtues. Lending money to a friend, or trying to get your degree, or trying to be a good parent or friend or spouse. You want to aim for your actions in each context to hit the middle column. If they don't, you have the deficiency of the virtue or the excess of the virtue. So we can take the top one. A courageous person knows how to figure out which situations require it. You might have an excess of this virtue, so if you were a soldier, you'd rush into battle too early and too often. And if you had the deficiency of the virtue, you'd be a coward. But if you possessed the virtue of courage itself, you'd know which battles to pick and choose. And that would be the virtuous choice. Same thing about, let's go all the way down to loyal. If you have too much loyalty, you're often venturing into the gullible territory. But if you don't have enough loyalty, you're fickle. So you can think about this maybe in the sense of a patron or an employer. So if you're confronted with a situation where your loyalty is tested, you have to pick and choose the reasons to remain loyal or to not remain loyal. And if your reasons aren't good enough, you are going toward the fickleness aspect of it. But if you're too permissive and you stay loyal to people even when they're violating your moral code, then you're going toward the gullibility. So with these kinds of virtues, try and think of a public life where none of them mattered. And Sandel doesn't think that that's possible. He gave a very detailed treatment of all of the above moral and political systems, so Kant and Rawls, utilitarianism, libertarianism, and he points out positives and negatives for each one of these. But in this final chapter that we're going to talk about, he argues that none of those systems can create a fully just society, because we can't take these values, these ways we ought to act or ought not to act, outside of our lives. And furthermore, governments, not just individuals, governments that are based in rights, in freedom, or in welfare, try to ignore this morality when they make their policies and their laws, because they're afraid of intolerance. We think about religious extremists that want to change laws so everyone has to live by their code of morality. And we recoil from that. We want tolerance. We want religious freedom. And we don't want any specific group to say that their value system is the only reasonable value system out there. So these classically liberal governments try and extricate or take away the value or moral aspect to all of the policies and laws and norms that they enforce. Okay, I'm going to stop right here for part 1. I'll see you in part 2.